Great. So we're recording now. Welcome everybody to Let's Talk Ottawa, Peacebuilding and the Convoy. So this is an event that's in response to the convoy protests that have been happening in Ottawa. And just for some background, let me just, yeah. So for some background, my name is Josh Nadeau, and I have a couple hats that I wear. So one of which is a dialogue facilitator. So I'm interested in dialogue as a tool to address polarization and these big divides that we can have when these societal conflicts and questions come up. I'm also a researcher, often in peace and conflict studies. So I'm actually doing graduate work at St. Paul University right now in Ottawa in the Faculty of Conflict Studies. So I'm writing my dissertation right now on societal conflicts kind of like this in North America. So this is something that's quite related to the work I do for there. I'm also a freelance writer. Sorry, the slides. The other thing is, does anybody know, actually, I'm kind of feeling a little, with Zoom sometimes I'm not very good. Does anybody know how to, when you're sharing the screen, how to make the little bar at the bottom go away? Because I'm realizing I can't see my whole screen. Does anybody know what to do about that? I
usually can move it to another screen. Okay. I don't know if you only have one screen.
Perfect. Oh yeah, if you have one screen, I found out I could move it. Okay, great. So research in peace and conflict studies. I'm also a freelance writer by trade. And I also do community organizing work. So events like this and other ones, some of you have participated in some of the events I've helped organize over the past year. And some of the themes that I'm really interested in are conflict, communication, dialogue, polarization, and informal education. So that's my background, and those are the kinds of lenses that are informing some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight. So Let's Talk Ottawa is an organization that I helped kind of co-found with a couple other colleagues in 2021. So representatives from the organization Initiatives of Change and also the Mahatma Gandhi Next Generation Leaders. So it was founded to help empower locals, like it says here, with conflict resolution, bridge building, and dialogue facilitation techniques. So when there are divides, especially in Ottawa, this is something that we're interested in. And so when the convoy protests started and all this polarization came up around it, obviously this was something that we were interested in addressing. So some of the events that we did previously was in last summer, we did a 4-part dialogue training, which some of you were at. And that was about how to kind of engage in dialogue and how to facilitate dialogue. And then in response to the convoy, we actually hosted a dialogue, an online dialogue between supporters and critics of the protesters. And that was actually a very interesting experience. And we'll talk a little bit about what happened then at that dialogue. But this workshop tonight, it's something different. So this is like, there's a lot of theories and tools and frameworks that people use in the peace building sphere. And by peace building, I mean when people are trying to build structures in society that are conducive to peace. So how to address the causes of conflict. So within that sphere of peace building, there's a lot of different tools that we can use, and they're not often applied to conflicts like this. It's usually to war or to development or to human rights issues. But this workshop is about how do we kind of look at the protest convoy conflict through that lens and see if there's any kind of insights or ways forward that come up. So what today's workshop is and isn't. So what it isn't, it's not a roadmap for solving the issue. It's not a way to process personal tension. So if you're feeling divided about this or that, or if you feel angry, that's not what tonight is about. Tonight is about giving information and tools. Those tensions can be explored in a dialogue format, but tonight isn't that kind of format. So again, yeah, it's not a space to share, dialogue over, or promote opinions. It's also, and this is really important, not an analysis of who's right or who's wrong. So we're not going to have a moral framework. We're going to be talking about what does it mean to look at it through a resolution, like through a lens of conflict resolution. It's also not an attempt at reporting or fact-finding. This is really important work, but this is a different kind of work. And it's also not a space to air frustrations or grievances, just because there needs to be a lot of space held for that. And unfortunately, we don't have the resources or the time for that tonight. So what it is, it's space to think about how what peace builders have learned might be applied in this kind of context, exploring if new insights or possibilities emerge when looking through this kind of perspective. Also thinking about what creative solutions or responses might be possible. Some limited discussion of how these concepts kind of emerge in our personal experiences. And we're also framing this as some kind of baby step. So this is not going to solve the complex issues surrounding the protest and why it happened, but it's trying to contribute to new directions and conversation. So what that means, not all perspectives are going to be addressed. You might think at different moments during the workshop, like, oh, but you didn't talk about this, and this is something that's really important too. That's true. So we can't cover everything. That's the nature of a small event like this. Ideally, this would be kind of a multi-part series where we would talk about all sorts of different elements with more time to get into the dilemmas, but unfortunately, we don't have that time. Although if people do have objections, feedbacks, or concerns about what's being presented, we'd like to hear them and we'd like to acknowledge them, even if we can't go deep into them. Another one is it's going to be a lot of information. So that's also why this is being recorded, so that people can go back and look it over if they want to do that. So again, somebody's unmuted, and we can kind of hear like somebody moving around the kitchen or something. I'm not sure, but just to let you know. And again, this is a really sensitive topic. So the approach that we take tonight for this material, it's not for everybody. And we don't have, lots of different groups have different needs, and we don't have the resources to accommodate all needs in this workshop, unfortunately. So we thank you in advance for your understanding and for helping us hold space for these ideas. So again, hello, I'm Josh Nadeau again. I'm in another time zone right now. This workshop is happening on my time from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. So I'm a little bit tired. I might not be entirely on the ball. So I also ask in advance for your understanding. Things to note before talking about the convoy. So we're going to be presenting some different information, tools, and kind of theories about how to understand it, but there's a couple kind of baseline things that are good to talk about first. First, breathe. So maybe a deep breath, a slow breath, just a pause. Just think about where you are right now in the room. Maybe during the introduction, some feelings were coming up, maybe some really strong feelings. What are those like? Just kind of sit with that for a moment. And the reason why we encourage this is because the first thing we talk about is you have a body. Congratulations. What we mean by that is that we're embodied creatures. And when that means that we come not only with these reason-like capacities and rational mind, but we come with nervous systems, and we come with emotional reactions, and all these things that get triggered in complicated contexts like this. So for many of us, our cultures emphasize head knowledge or physical and emotional experiences, which means that we can get kind of abstract about this and say, oh, I think this, but really also in our bodies, we're having all sorts of other processes. Maybe we get anxious. Maybe it's hard for us to look at a different perspective because we're really feeling under threat. Those are physical reactions that are normal, and they affect the way that we approach conflicts. So what? So the human brain has mechanisms for protecting itself if it sees itself as being threatened. And that means that it's very easy in polarizing contexts like this to jump into defense mode. When we're in defense mode, it's a complete other kind of track that our brains work in. And this is something that's talked about a lot in cognitive science and also in peace building. So when we're in the defense mode, we protect ourselves, our groups, and our values. We focus on immediate solutions over long-term sustainable solutions. And there are other kind of symptoms of being triggered too. Like, for example, I don't know, anybody who's ever been a teenager or ever raised a teenager knows that sometimes we just kind of like get tunnel vision and we focus on one thing so much that we kind of exclude other nuances in the picture. So when we get triggered and when we get worked up and when we get worried, our nervous system puts us in defense mode where it's kind of hard to see the whole picture. This is normal. We don't want to stigmatize this. It means that if you feel triggered and that you can only focus on one thing and not the other thing, it means that your body is healthy and is reacting to threat like a normal human body. It's important to note that the body doesn't distinguish between concrete and perceived threats. So if we are in like a polarized context, or if somebody says something that just gets us on edge, that's a healthy reaction. And even if it doesn't have like an actual physical danger for us, our bodies still process it like that often. So this is sometimes why we react really sharp or react in ways that might surprise us. This makes processing the conflict more complicated because we can easily lose out on nuance when we're in defense mode. But it also means that we're paying attention to the fact that we have needs, that we want safety, that we want something, and paying attention to those needs is good. So conflict transformation and conflict resolution is about processing these feelings and needs and acknowledging the fact that not everybody's in the same place. So when it comes to the trucker convoy, different people are affected differently, and some people are going to be more triggered than others. And that means that possible dialogue or conversation is going to be different depending on what your lived experience is. Yeah, so I kind of, this is why I just mentioned that. This is normal, that not everybody's in a place to start dialoguing. And it means that conflict resolution advocates, we have to take different people's needs into account when we try to move forward or think of new ways to move forward. So yeah, this is kind of a constant task. So when we have something like escalation, usually it's, can you guys see my mouse, or is it just the slides?
We can see your mouse.
Great. So when we have, and this is from kind of like broader like conflict theory. So we have like a crisis, it can trigger X person, and they go into defense mode and they do something to defend themselves or to defend their group or to defend their values. And sometimes the thing that they do triggers Y person, who might be on the same camp as they are, who might be in a different camp. But all of a sudden the crisis triggers somebody who then triggers somebody else. And then the cycle begins. So when person Y is triggered, they react in a way that further triggers like X, who then further triggers Y, and it starts this this big loop that once it starts getting going, it can be really hard to interrupt. And then all these different triggers can actually launch a new crisis, which then kind of consolidates the whole thing. So people are acting in response to something they perceive as threatening, and their bodies are reacting to defend themselves. But the ways that we try to defend ourselves can sometimes make the conflict escalate. And so when we're talking about peace building, we're talking about ways to try to like pause, interrupt this process, not interrupt your needs, but interrupt this process that keeps escalating. And this is why we talk about, for example, breathing. What are ways that we can create space to not just react to things? But that's going to be harder for some people than others, and not because they're less good at something, but because if somebody's affected more, like somebody who lives in downtown Ottawa and has been hearing the horns is going to think about things very differently than somebody who doesn't hear the horn, who didn't hear the horns every day. So these differences have to be taken into account, and there's no one size fits all. So again, these cycles of escalation are normal. Our bodies are doing what we need to do. We need to learn how to move forward while respecting and not repressing the body. So how can we do that? Breathe again. So today's Hi, Kia. I think your microphone is not mute, so we can hear some background noise. Perfect, thank you. So maybe again, while we were talking about some of these kind of introductory things, maybe some people found it already triggering. And so we invite, again, space to breathe. When we do that, take space, interrupt the urge to react immediately. What is your body telling you? What about your mind or your heart? What do you notice? And these kinds of like skills of like noticing what's happening in our bodies or what's emerging when we're being triggered, this is something that takes a lot of training to develop, so that we can actually do it when we're in the moment. But this is something that can help. And in case anybody is feeling triggered in this workshop, or feeling threatened by anything that's being said, there will be moments as we go along that we stop, we pause, we breathe. So part of the task of peace building is listening to the body. It's not your job not to be triggered, and it's not everybody's job to build bridges. Not everybody wants to be a bridge builder, but if you do want to engage in this kind of work, it helps if you keep in mind these different processes that are working inside you. Because oftentimes people who want to do peace work are because they were affected by some kind of conflict. And being affected by a conflict sometimes means that things trigger us. So if we want to kind of work to heal different conflicts or different wounds, it can really help to become aware of these processes inside of us. So again, like I mentioned earlier, peace building is about trying to understand how to transcend the cycle of escalation, respecting people's need for immediate safety with the need to build a common future. So that is the approach we're going to be taking today. So this is one of our pauses here. How are things so far? What are you noticing in your body as we speak about these things? And do you have any questions? We have a limited space, maybe 5 minutes or so to kind of reflect, and then we have to move on. But I'm curious how things are right now. Does this resonate? Does this seem like bull? How are we doing?
Your voice is really calm and reassuring, and it's really helpful.
Okay. That's because I'm tired.
I have a question. So I experienced abuse in my childhood, which means that it's very easy for me to get into a place of being triggered, of being in fight, flight, and freeze. And I'm wondering if that means that I just should give up on my hope that I can take on peace building roles because I'm just too easily triggered and I feel unsafe too easily.
I don't know, like there's like, it's not my right to like say yes or no, right? Like this is your journey. It does mean that you'll have particular needs, and those needs might be different from other people. It might present some like particular complications, but it might also mean that it gives you extra insight. So in my experience, I've met people who don't understand why somebody else is triggered. And when we mentioned earlier, one of these slides about living in a culture that emphasizes head knowledge or physical and emotional experiences. Sometimes some people are so in their head that they don't understand why somebody can get triggered and what impact that has on their body. And if somebody doesn't know what that means and what that's like, there might be less compassion or empathy or understanding for those people. So maybe your experience, it might make things more complicated because you might easily feel unsafe, but at the same time, you might have a lot of empathy and understanding for people who are in similar situations. So but that's just something off the top of my head. I don't think that it excludes anything, but yeah. Any other questions? Again, I can't see the chat and I can't see raised hands. So
Josh, I have a question that I'm going to be asking anonymously on behalf of a person.
Yeah.
Around being a bridge builder requires vulnerability and courage, particularly when employed by one side in the convoy, fear of frozen bank accounts, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not a question. It's more of a comment.
Can you repeat it?
I can repeat it. It is around being a bridge builder requires vulnerability and courage, particularly when employed by one side, in quotation marks, in the convoy.
Yeah.
Fear of frozen bank accounts, etc.
So, like, I definitely like agree that like it does kind of take courage and vision to try to work as a bridge builder, but no matter what side of the conflict you're on. Right now, because things are still kind of escalating in some ways in Canada, on one hand, like the protest is like the physical protest has been removed by the police as far as I understand, but there's still different kind of conversations and other things that are kind of escalating. So different people are at risk of different things. And this is something that's a reality. So definitely.
For further clarification, the entire protest downtown hasn't been fully removed yet. It
Okay,
could
I've just
take
seen videos. Sorry,
yeah, you've seen videos, a large percentage of it's been removed, but there's been talk of it extending until next weekend and subsequent weekends.
Okay, cool. Thank you for the clarification. So also, because I'm not in Ottawa, like at this moment, like there might be some, yeah, like it's good to clarify and bring stuff up. So are there any other comments or questions about what we just covered about being triggered and peace building and cycles of escalation? If not, then we'll move on. So if the first part, kind of component of tonight's material is this kind of embodied aspect of we have bodies and they affect how we do this kind of work. The second thing that I want to talk about tonight is that there are different kinds of peace. And I'm going to talk about peace like as a, so within the realm of like peace and conflict studies, like or peace building, like we see what's happening with the protesters as a social conflict, as a societal conflict, and so when we think about peace, it's like what are the different ways we can resolve this? What are the different possible end games? So there are kind of two broad types of peace that we kind of talk about in the field, so two ways to resolve conflict and tension. One is called negative peace, and one is called positive peace. So the terminology is not great because it kind of implies that one is like bad and one is good. That's not what it's about. Negative peace is what happens when a conflict is resolved by creating distance from a threatening object. So when we say negative, it's the absence of something. So the absence of threat, the absence of violence. So a negative peace is about putting distance between you and the thing that's threatening you. So it could be like dominating them or like conquest. It could be separating yourself from there either through segregation, or it could also be through creating safe spaces. It could be about like avoiding somebody or having an uneasy truce where you don't talk about underlying issues, but you just agree to disagree. And it addresses immediate needs. For example, safety. Although there are other needs that are involved too. Like for example, if somebody wants to dominate somebody else, that can also be this expression of that. I'm noticing there's some chats in the notes in the chats. Yeah, so there'll be a copy of the slides afterwards. Also, there's the recording. So there's going to be a lot of information. Actually, it's going to be information dumped tonight, unfortunately. So the other kind of peace is called positive peace. And this is a resolution that like, there's kind of two components. People talk about it in two ways. Like one way that people talk about it is like, if negative peace is the absence of violence or the absence of threat, positive peace is like constructing like a society that, like with structures that produce peace. So like equality and respect for human rights and respect for dignity. But ultimately, it's about including the other camp's needs into your vision of the future. So we can think about it as negative peace is my vision of the future kind of excludes the threatening party. Positive peace is my vision of the future includes them. And we have to find a way to address all the different needs involved. And if we can figure that out, that's what positive peace is. So different kind of like paths that people have talked about for that is like through dialogue, through reconciliation, promoting unity and cohesion. It addresses long-term needs. For example, creating a common future. So negative peace and positive peace are not like good and bad. It's about like, how do we address immediate needs and how do we address long-term needs? Unfortunately though, it's these things can kind of come into conflict as well. So if you're only building negative peace, this is like ultimate segregation or escalation until one side wins. If you're only building positive peace, sometimes you can promote unity or dialogue without addressing why somebody feels threatened. So maybe you say, oh, everything is fine, we're including everybody, but there's still these tensions because nothing is resolved. Peace builders have been historically guilty of this. So it's like, if, for example, we want to take like a marginalized group and say, oh, we all just need to live together. But if they still feel marginalized, they might still continue feeling unsafe in that society, even though it's integrated. So like too much like focus on positive peace or too much focus on negative peace, they're both kind of have their pros and cons. Building both means trying to address immediate needs, laying the groundwork for long-term reconciliation, structural changes, and trust building. So it's about trying to figure out, okay, how do we figure out what the needs are on the ground that need to be addressed, and like what do we need to do to think about it long-term. So when thinking about positive and negative peace, again, it's not your job not to be triggered. Negative peace is often a response to being triggered, to trying to defend kind of yourself or your group or your values against something that seems threatening. It's not everybody's job to build bridges. Sometimes it's somebody's job to protect something. But if you, I think this is actually a repeated slide from the, yes, so this is a repeated slide, sorry about that. But the point is still there. So with positive and negative peace, it's not necessarily anybody's job to do one or the other, but if we want to be doing peace work, then it pays to kind of know that there are these different approaches and they can often come into conflict. So actually there are often conflicts between activists or people who are trying to do one or the other. So what we're doing today is asking what reaching for both might look like in the context of the convoy. So if you're primarily interested in negative peace, that's okay. That means that you have needs or concerns that require immediate attention. This approach might not be for you. Contemporary peace builders try to combine both while looking for creative solutions. Often, like, we don't know what we're doing entirely yet, like it's trial and error, and we're like getting closer, but it's still not quite there. So this is still, and every single context produces different challenges. So again, it's trial and error. So what does this mean? In this workshop, we're going to assume that all sides in the convoy conflict are legitimate and have legitimate needs. And that if we want to go towards a vision of positive peace, that means that all the different camps, and not just supporters or critics of the protests, but like all like the different kind of like people who are involved, there needs to be space for them in our common future. And so that's kind of the task. And that's the approach that this workshop is going to take. That doesn't mean that both sides are equally right, or that the strategies that are used are not problematic. It just means that the job of the peace builder is addressing all needs and building an inclusive future where we can all thrive. This is like, that's a pretty like idealistic thing though, but it's something we can get closer towards and build something that's closer to positive peace, real positive peace over time. So you don't have to agree with this approach. On this call, like, people are in different spaces and not everybody is ready to or even desires to engage in this kind of work. What we're talking about today is what we can do if we do feel called to this kind of work. So if you aren't in a space where you see the other side as having legitimate needs that need to be met, this approach will likely not resonate with you. And that's okay. I won't be sad if you leave the call or if you kind of say, this isn't for you. And we come to another break. So if you're feeling like there's some kind of reaction in your body, or some kind of resistance to things that are being said or talked about, that's okay. But we just invite you to notice that, and to think about how you would like to react. So we're actually making quite good time, so we can have a bit of discussion at this point. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We can go back to our where we can see each other. Feel free to turn on your video again if you'd like. So just checking in. What do you think of all this?
I was going to say that in the first break, I felt very like in fight or flight, like just like the introduction of like what we're going to talk about. And it was just kind of adrenaline pumping through my body. And after this last block of information, I feel more peaceful, because just what you described of like how you would like to move forward with particularly this session, like that's what I desire, and I can feel that peace kind of flooding my body. So that was helpful.
Yeah, I didn't know what to expect at first either, but the breathing exercises, like I'm used to them, and it's just a natural reaction. Now, as soon as I start breathing deeply, I just feel at peace. So I'm ready to go for the debate or whatever we are going to do in the coming future.
So no debate tonight so much, but I think there'll be definitely plenty of space for conversations in the future.
Josh, can I ask about a word you used? You were talking about legitimate positions, and I'm not sure I understand what an illegitimate position could be. Can you give an example of what's a legitimate position, what's an illegitimate position?
So did I say legitimate position or legitimate need?
Could have been need. I don't recall.
Okay, so I think it was need, because for example, like a position is like the thing that I say, like I support this, right? So there's a lot of debate about whether certain positions are legitimate or not. So the classic example is like Nazi Germany, where this society is better than this society, and that means that this other society can be killed. Some people morally see this as an illegitimate position. Like if you present me with that position, I will not accept it as legitimate, and I find it unacceptable, and I will resist that. Versus a legitimate position is one that we say, okay, that has a right to exist within the moral universe that I live in. And it's something that I can have a dialogue with. So right now, like with the convoy, depending on the person we're talking to, some positions might be seen as legitimate or illegitimate. Does anybody, can anybody give an example of what I'm talking about? Positions about the convoy that might be seen as legitimate or illegitimate?
I do. I think that, well, I don't know, this is judgment, but just having children present at the convoy, I find as being, to me, an illegitimate need. I don't know if you need me to explain further.
No, that's a good example. I would say illegitimate position, like something that somebody says,
yes.
Oh, it's okay to have children at the convoy. That's a position that they take. And so for you, that's like illegitimate. That's something that can't be entertained, or
Well, once the police were starting to say this is once it was confirmed this was illegal. I don't know. I don't want to get into too much of a debate, but I think once it became very transparent that this was going to be ended possibly by force, to me that's when it became an illegitimate position.
That's a really good example. Anybody else?
I would think that a legitimate position would be if you were to be protesting based on the ability for freedom of speech or right to protest or anything like that, but anything that comes with hate speech, anything that goes to the level of pure hate, I guess that's where it loses its legitimacy in my mind.
Yeah, so this is a really important thing too. Like something can be seen as having legitimacy, but like we each have a different line after which something loses legitimacy. And it's really interesting to think how are we going to treat somebody after, or somebody's position or somebody's group after they've like lost legitimacy in our mind. And this is also like something that's an important part of the conversation.
And for me, a lot of it comes down to epistemology. How do we know what is? And having various epistemological differences on the foundation of what is gets things complicated very quickly, and is often a inhibitive for peace building and bridge building.
That is like.
Rochelle, are you trying to add something, or is that background noise?
No. Sorry, I'll turn my mic off. Sorry.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so those are like when we're talking about like legitimate or illegitimate positions, like those are kinds of examples of the conversation that happens around that, where it's like, okay, I will treat some ideas with respect, but I will not respect other ideas. And maybe something starts as legitimate, but becomes illegitimate because of something that happens. So a popular kind of point with the convoy, as I've observed, is that for some people, the appearance of any hate speech in the convoy or any kind of symbol or flag makes the entire convoy illegitimate. Whereas for others, they resist that and they're saying that's not fair. So this is a conversation and a conflict that appears around legitimacy. So those are legitimate positions. Legitimate needs. In this framework, all needs are legitimate. And needs here are for safety, for autonomy, for dignity, survival, like all that Maslow kind of stuff that many of us have heard of before. So like the needs that we have, the basic needs as human beings, like those are all legitimate. And so this kind of approach is about what are the needs that are underneath our positions, and how do we try to deal with those needs rather than the positions themselves. So I don't know if that answers your question, Stefan, but like that's kind of some of the logic behind some of this.
Thank you.
So was it clear what this positive and negative piece thing is? It can be like a big drop of theory. What do you guys think about that? And do you feel like you gravitate more towards one or the other sometimes?
I think the pendulum is swinging in my life, but I don't remember hearing about negative peace in that way. It makes total sense. You know, I'm not ready to deal with this. I guess I need to distance myself from that. And I like that connotation of negative peace. It's good to never give up on striving toward peace. So that negative connotation, I thought is powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when the theories kind of came up, like negative peace was kind of treated as a bad thing. Like, oh, this is like a bad kind of peace, and positive peace is like the good kind of peace. But later we kind of realized that like, oh, there's something important here too in addressing, maybe I'm not ready for something, maybe I'm too scared. And then it's like the task is to protect that part of myself until like I'm ready to engage, if I am ever. But the problem is that when everybody is engaged in negative peace, then the cycle of escalation could come up and kind of wreck with things. So any other questions or reflections before we move on? Sarah?
Josh, there's another anonymous question.
So I think Sarah raised her hand first, and then we can do the anonymous question.
I think what I'm appreciating a lot is the idea that like if I'm in the position, if I find myself in the position where I can't hear people from the other side because I'm not feeling safe, that it's okay to take the time I need to get to a better place, and I'm not obliged to be the peacemaker, the bridge builder if I'm not ready for it. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because sometimes it feels like I have to take on that role even if I'm not feeling safe, and I don't think it's going to be successful then.
Yeah, I think that like your story would resonate with a lot of people who kind of feel forced into this kind of role, and it's really like unfortunate, and like sometimes like really harmful when somebody feels like they have to keep putting themselves in danger to do what they think is right, or to keep putting themselves in a threatening position, and it's really complicated, especially if there's a feeling like of guilt or like duty that like they have to do this. So this is not easy stuff. Christina, anonymous question number 2.
Okay, so it isn't a question. It is partly a question. It's also a comment, or a query rather. Please explain more about legitimate needs behind illegitimate actions. Illegitimate actions including children at the police action and criminal behaviors.
So I think this is something we'll talk about a little bit more, like in the kind of 4th part of the workshop. So we have like kind of 4 chunks of like theory. The first 2 we've already done. Those are kind of the intro things, but we had 2 kind of other chunks, and we're going to get to that in the 4th chunk. But from the peace building point of view, for example, if we talk about terrorism, sometimes the needs that are driving terrorist acts are needs for autonomy for your country. If it's occupied by somebody, it could be a need for recognition. It could be a need to break out of an abusive situation. So criminal activity can actually arise from like a desire for survival, for a desire to affirm that I have the right to exist, things like this. And this is kind of one of the keys of like this kind of peace building work, and like kind of interrupting this cycle of escalation. So if we remember the cycle, like people starting to trigger each other, and it keeps on escalating until something like kind of explodes. One thing that we can do to interrupt that cycle is when we see something problematic, something criminal, something that we see as illegitimate, like in front of us, one of our choices is we can get like, if we feel triggered, we might like do something that can then trigger them or trigger somebody else, like some kind of reaction. But if we look at them and see that, oh, there's a need under here that's like legitimate and needs to be met, and this activity is coming out of this place of an unmet need, then like, what if we find a way to legitimately meet that need? Maybe they might be open to some kind of creative solution. And this is something that an interesting example from kind of armed conflict is a lot of us know that in Colombia, it was quite bad for about 50 years. There was a rebel group called the FARC, and they reached a peace agreement in 2016. And part of what that deal was this terrorist organization. They were fighting for various kind of local groups, also people that felt that they were marginalized. The rebel group was transformed into a political party, and included into the government. And so now they continue their struggle for rights, for inclusion, for different things as a political party. And this was part of the transformation of that conflict. So finding creative solutions to meet the needs of people that are otherwise expressing those needs in violent or triggering ways. So that's an extreme example of what that could look like.
Thank you.
Joey, did you have a question? And then Rochelle? I don't know, Joe.
No, I just thought of the FLQ,
Yeah.
Parti Québécois, same sort of thing.
Exactly. Rochelle?
Sorry, I came late because I had some family stuff. But I don't know if this is helpful in responding to what Christina has said. I mean, I've talked to other people actually on this call. I mean, I bring my kids to political events that I go to. And while I'm sort of very careful about sort of safety and you know, and the situations around that, I mean, it's something that I do and something I really want to continue to do, right? Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that many people in the protests sort of felt what they were doing was sort of a legitimate kind of political action that they wanted their kids to be part of, right? And then the other thing, I mean, on the other side of it, I've worked with children in armed conflict overseas. And Josh, this is speaking to what you're sort of saying about more creative solutions. The response often to dealing with children and taking children out of harm's way is to sort of say, that's not a legitimate, you know, you don't have legitimacy when you do that, right? It's not a legitimate thing to put kids in harm's way. You know, that's not what, you know, we can't deal with you, right? You can't be respected by other people if this is how you act. And so let's find another way for you to express yourself politically, and that being tied to saying, you know, let's get kids out of this, right? Let's put them aside. And I don't know, I mean, I did this, I had a chat with, you know, somebody who happened to go to school with my son, right? And you know, and sort of, you know, and he wasn't planning on protesting in front of the school, but, you know, but showed up with his vehicle with flags on it, and just discussion like, you know, this is, you know, isn't it a great thing that we're not going to do this in front of our kids' school, right? And isn't it nice that they don't have to deal with these problems? And, you know, and that's just not where we're at right now, and let's kind of keep it that way. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, Josh, I don't know what you would think of that, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's like what you're talking about is like really relevant in the sense that like trying to find other ways to meet certain needs so as to like bring an end to certain actions that might be detrimental to some group. So when we're talking about the convoy, for example, and we'll be doing this a little bit later, and then we'll have a discussion at the end about like how this could have been handled differently, for example, if we don't like the way it was handled, or if we do like the way it was handled, if there was anything we would still change. Like what are creative solutions that we can try to offer that would resonate with the different people involved, and still include them in our vision for the common future. It's kind of like the holy grail of what people are trying to do, and it's not easy, or sometimes not always possible, like, or not necessarily possible right now. But this is what people are aiming towards when they're thinking about this. So I'm gonna go back into the screen share. Thanks everyone for contributing. So the first half of the information dump is over. Part 3 is about understanding conflict and building a map. So one of the things that conflict resolution professionals and peace builders do is they try to build a map of the conflict, and figure out what are the different pieces involved, and what does looking at these different pieces offer us in terms of understanding, and how can we respond to it differently. So these are 6 kind of different aspects of conflict mapping that might be relevant for the convoy. These aren't the only ones. There's lots of other factors too that about other kinds of conflict that are not included here. Like, for example, resources, like nobody, or, you know, we're not talking about resources here, but there are 6 kinds of things: leadership, outside support, power structures, unequal access, narratives and information or misinformation, and then needs and identity. We're going to focus on one of these as kind of a deep dive, but we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these and see how they might help us to like illuminate like the convoy situation. So with leadership, When peace builders are looking at this, there's like two big questions. First is like credibility. Who do we trust and find credible? And who do and don't certain people follow, and why? So here it's about who are the kind of elite figures that have influence, and what information do we trust and from what sources in this way? For some people, why do they believe the Canadian government or the health system? Why do they not believe? This is something that's often seen through a lens of legitimacy, especially with kind of societal conflicts about vaccines. So there was kind of this famous moment, and I'm not sure if I'm going to represent it correctly, when Trudeau at the beginning came out and said that the protesters have unacceptable views. What's interesting is some people are going to find him a credible leader and like believe that, whereas others, they're going to see that and they're going to lose more trust in the institutions that he represents. So leadership can affect these elements of a conflict. So there's that aspect, who's credible and who's a credible voice, which then kind of goes into what can be done to restore credibility and rebuild trust, and what can be done to regain trust. So there's a lot that's kind of being said right now about Trudeau's response, or kind of institutional Canadian responses. And for some people, they really like what he did, and some people, they find that like he kind of broke trust with them, and it makes it harder to believe him in the future. So when we're thinking about like, okay, so what are the different dynamics that are involved? If people don't trust him, and if they feel like they have good reasons not to trust him, what is that going to mean in the future when certain institutions say this is a good thing to do? So there's that aspect, which is kind of important. Another is about, with leadership, is about diversity. So different leaders, even in the same camp, that are seeking different things. So for example, in the protest convoy, I've kind of heard just like a little bit, but what are some of the different like leadership figures and different factions that people are aware of? And this is a question you can unmute and respond if you'd like.
Well, one of the most obvious was like Tamara Litch from Canada Unity, and they had a whole political manifesto that they had out. But there were lots of others who didn't subscribe to that political manifesto, but still also were part of the protest for other reasons.
Mm-hmm. Great. Does anybody else want to add anything to that? What are some of the different camps in the protester movement that we can identify? Melanie? I don't hear you. Are you on mute? You look like you're on mute.
Yeah, I was on mute. Sorry. Just a few folks in the protester camps that I'm aware of. There's like some like there's like yogis trying to do like meditations and stuff, and dancers. There's also like the truckers, and like I only observe from afar too. But and then there's some groups that have organized since the beginning of the pandemic who are also seem to be involved. I think it's like Ottawa Gatineau Freedom Club and stuff. Mm. So there's different like camps within, from my understanding, in the convoy movement itself.
Yeah, and so like these different camps have different leaders, and some of them are saying different things. Like I've heard a lot about this Pat King character, and I don't know like much about him. I've just heard like lots of different things that people are saying. But apparently there's also tension between different leaders, and like this is going to affect like how okay, lots of hands coming up right now, how things are kind of being done and what solutions we can offer. So there's Christina, and then there's Sarah. Christina.
So another comment from an anonymous person. one of the groups, anti-government individual rights, anti-government people, individual rights, pro-gas and oil people as well.
Mm-hmm. I've also heard that there's like a kind of pro-West, like pro-Western Canada. That can be also kind of like there are also different religious groups that are involved. And this is like a really big diversity. And so that really affects the different dynamics and like what solutions we can offer. Sorry, Christina?
Sorry, there's one of the heads of this protest is actually from a small city that's a half hour away from my family's farm in Saskatchewan. So it's a small world.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Sarah, you had your hand up too?
It's okay. I think I'll pass.
Okay, great. Richard?
I was just going to say there's a very strong evangelical Christian element to taking regular time out to pray.
Great. Yeah, and like all these different groups are there for different reasons, and the different leaders of those groups are also there for different reasons, and this might affect, again, like what kinds of solutions might resonate with different people. So that's like with leadership, and there's like outside support. Are there outside funding and ideas that are impacting realities on the ground? So this is something that people are talking about a lot, especially with freezing bank accounts, trying to look at the money from GoFundMe, different crowdfunding. There's a lot of discussion about how certain influence is coming from the United States and certain movements there. And those might be like impacting reality on the ground as well. But also another side of that is who's reporting on the event from the outside and what stories are they communicating? So like that's also kind of outside support. If one kind of camp in the protest or anti-protest, or if they're receiving more media support, then that's also kind of outside support that's legitimizing them and delegitimizing the other. So these are also factors we have to kind of take into account when we're thinking about creative solutions. Sarah?
One thing that I've been very careful to do from the beginning of the convoy, like as soon as I first learned about it, was that I immediately started researching who the leaders were, who the top spokespeople were, what they were saying in their own words. I was looking at their Facebook Live, YouTube Live feeds, all of their media, their podcast interviews on far right podcasts, and I was trying to understand them from their own perspective. Mm-hmm. And so I guess the thing that really struck me was the expression of some very frightening ideologies to me that they were expressing in their own words. And so that was something that I, like from the beginning, I've been actually paying attention to their media and what they've been saying in their own words. And that's why I'm so scared.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing, Sarah. So what are some possible responses to these dynamics? How can we respond to these different elements in ways that might try to address immediate needs and long-term needs?
I would think active listening, trying to, like is that like an immediate response?
Like for example, like these particular like issues here, it's about credibility. So some people have trust and some people don't. There's a diversity of people in these different groups that have different needs and have different ideas. And they're being supported by outsiders who have agendas. So these are like the kind of three things we're talking about here. So, and they create dynamics that can exacerbate the conflict. So I'm more thinking about like what can be done about like these, or like what are some ideas or thoughts about what are ways that like as peace builders we can respond to those elements. Or is this something that we can do on the ground? Christina?
Another comment from an anonymous person. Embodying what we want to see, being curious about our brothers and sisters.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's especially true if, for example, when we're talking about diversity, if we're kind of, if we have a narrative that everybody on the other side is the same and that everybody supports the same things, that can become complicated if, for example, like hate speech appears within one of those camps and becomes associated with all the camps. Like, what does it mean to try to figure out how these camps work, how they relate to each other, what's the reality on the ground? So in that sense, trying to figure out more about like what other people like think and believe, that can be really helpful when trying to recognize diversity in that way. Stefan?
Yeah, if we're talking about building credibility or building trust, I think the only way to do it is to make a promise and then to keep it. And the promise should be specific. So for example, I was disappointed repeatedly by law enforcement when they would make promises such as, we have put up this kind of blockade, or we have banned this sort of thing. And then there didn't seem to be enforcement on that on their part. So regardless of whether or not, or like they were not able to build trust with me through those actions because they made specific promises and did not keep them.
Great, thank you for the for the example. So like when one of the things that can help with conflict is like having institutions that we can trust, and like that kind of deserve our trust in different ways. And so if we don't feel like the police are doing what we think they should be doing, then that can also create tensions or exacerbate tensions or make people feel more unsafe and lash out in different ways if they're in that kind of spot. Another kind of narrative I've heard a lot of is because a lot of the people in the convoy protest are skeptical of government and are skeptical that the government cares about them. And there can be work done to try to see why the government has lost their trust and what are things that can be done to regain that. So that's like if somebody gives like when there are health recommendations that are coming out, if you don't trust the source that it comes from, then people are going to be less likely to actually do it. So that's kind of another element. Why don't people trust? And is there something people can do to earn or regain trust? Richard?
I think we need to somehow show that it is possible to recognize legitimate need without legitimizing illegitimate action.
Yep. Yep. Definitely. This is like one of the like top things. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that might look like a little bit later when we talk about needs and identity. So we're going to keep moving. Daryl, I saw your hand.
Yeah, just listening to everyone, it made me think of a question. Like, my question is like, what if Trudeau is behind everything? Even Trudeau's behind the truckers convoy, just so he can throw the Emergencies Act upon us and strip all the citizens of their rights, just so the government can take over. That's what listening to everyone made me just think of out of the blue.
So it sounds like to me like you have very little trust in government.
Yes.
Yeah. So like that's something that like is a factor here, definitely. And that's a voice. Thanks, Daryl. So other elements of conflict mapping, we're talking about power structures, unequal access, narratives, and misinformation. So when we're talking about power structures, how do different camps manifest different types of power? One thing that's kind of spoken about a lot is like some people accuse the protesters of having power of white privilege, of XYZ. That's a narrative that kind of exists that's that by having the trucks planted in one spot, they're kind of taking the downtown hostage. And because the police don't want to move in, that gives them power. So some people are accusing the protesters of misusing power. And there are some narratives on the protester side that talk about how the anti-protesters have more power because eventually the police action moves in So there's different kinds of power that people are worried about. And so a question is, can we address different kinds of power imbalances at the same time? Because when we're triggered, sometimes all we see is the imbalance that doesn't favor us. We don't necessarily see the kind of power that we have that the other side might actually be afraid of or might make them anxious. Another is about unequal access. So who feels marginalized and why? Are there asymmetries in how groups are being treated? And by asymmetries, this is kind of similar to the power, like, are some people in different groups being marginalized more than others? So somebody who's on the protester side, who is against mandates or even against the COVID vaccine, they might feel that they have very little power over their lives because of the restrictions. Whereas somebody who's in downtown Ottawa with the horns every day, they might feel like they have less power to like go about their daily life, and that the protester is like holding the city, like holding the downtown hostage. So again, on both sides, people are feeling disempowered in different ways. And how can we respond? Like for peace builders, the task is, how do we respond to these different asymmetries while keeping both of those sets of needs in mind? And then the third one, narratives and misinformation. This is kind of similar. Like there are stories in each camp that are being told about the other. And are there ways that we can compare notes to figure out if our story is accurate? And somebody was mentioning active listening before, and figuring out what the other side actually looks like. And this is really something that has to do with this category. So are there ways that we can compare notes, and what obstacles prevent this? So what are some possible ways we can respond to these factors as peace builders? Or if you don't identify as a peace builder, how might you want to respond to it regardless? Stefan?
Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to trying to understand other people's point of view and to hear directly from them what their concerns are, what their needs are. But on the previous slide, we had identified that there are different camps in the protest. And so I don't know that it's, do we have enough bandwidth or enough time to understand all of the different camps? And if we can't, then we can't encompass all of their views.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm making the perfect the enemy of the good, but I don't understand how to listen to everyone. I don't think I can.
Yeah, like it's not, again, like one risk of talking about this kind of work is kind of this this feeling that like, oh, we have to do everything, right? When like that's not true. Like we're humans, and like especially for those of us who have families, like especially with like small children, or if we have dependents, like our bandwidth for all of this is like really limited, you know? So like it would be really great if there were people who are like paid to help with this, you know, like if this was somebody's job, you know, like this is kind of like let's get some grants, you know, like let's get people who are trained to do this kind of thing, who can then kind of help demystify this, like create resources that are that make it very easy to understand like who's doing what and what the different tensions are. So this is what conflict mapping actually is. So like we when there's a war and people are recovering from the war, or people are intervening in the war, usually there's a lot of money that goes to it because war is expensive and some people don't want to keep paying for that. So it's like there's a lot of money that goes towards creating really intricate and complex maps, but we don't have this kind of thing for societal conflicts, because it's always easier to think about something after it's hits the critical point of violence than before. So one of the obstacles is getting resources that allow us to do good conflict mapping and good work and make it accessible to people. So it's not a note of hope, because there isn't that yet. Maybe there's going to be more desire for that, like with the convoy, who knows? But somebody could definitely make the case. Were there other thoughts about how to possibly respond to factors like power, access, and narratives when there are all these different sides at once?
I think for myself, the narrative stuff is the most prevalent, because sometimes I hear what other people are saying in their narratives and find them incredulous and like non-believable. And I don't understand how they could believe that.
Mhm.
And maybe I just need more discussion and more contact and more listening to be able to better understand that, those points of views.
Mhm. And what's interesting is that like it's harder to do that when we're triggered, because like then it's like, oh, I need to, like, this is dangerous. This is a dangerous narrative. I need to like get on social media and like disprove all of it, you know, which like usually doesn't work anyway, right? Because if another person is triggered, they're not going to believe your information, right? So this is an example of the cycle. People are triggering each other with dangerous information on like social media, and it just escalates and nothing gets done. So that's like, yeah, like what you're talking about is a very real thing. And one thing that was interesting when we did our dialogue a couple of weeks ago was there was an exercise where we were talked not about what we found wrong with the other side, but what we found wrong with our side and our approach. And this kind of starts complicating this very easy tendency to see, oh, all of their narratives are unbelievable because maybe they find our narratives unbelievable. And maybe they have legitimate reasons for that. Andre or Hannah?
Yeah, it's me. I think a possible response, especially in terms of the narratives, would be to critique inflammatory language on both sides. So, for example, language coming from our Prime Minister about this is a fringe minority with unacceptable views, being able to critique that or use better language of these are brother and sister Canadians who are struggling, and reframe that, because then that leadership, that language then trickles down into the rest of the population. And then, you know, on the other side, I know that the Canada Unity had that manifesto that essentially called for overthrowing the government, like being able to like critique that and say like, look, like this was a government that was elected. They're a minority government, but like they were still democratically elected. Whether or not there are problems with, you know, how our democracy works in terms of elections and you know, potential election reform, they were still democratically elected, and we've got to abide by that. So, you know, like we can critique that and say like, it's pretty inflammatory, or that might be unreasonable, but like, let's look for something that we can come to terms with or can start dialogue on. So, yeah,
and we should also consider maybe that Trudeau felt triggered with all the F Trudeau flags that were being flown around. And so it like, yeah, I can see the circle of escalation going there.
Yep.
Yeah, and like we were like just in the last slide, we were talking about how leadership impacts different things. And this is also a really clear example. Like sometimes the example that's set by trusted leaders trickles down. And so if somebody like finds Trudeau credible, like they might find the ideas that he has about the other side credible. Or if we have leadership on the protest side that are saying that the government is like illegitimate, those thoughts also float downriver. So this is all like all a thing. So basically all these different factors, when we're looking at conflict mapping, every single one of these aspects is a lens that we can use to look at the conflict and figure out, oh, what are the different sides involved? Like what are the different needs that are involved? And to start suggesting solutions, different solutions based on each of these different factors that are like, that might take both sides into account. But all these factors deserve their own workshop and their own kind of thing of analysis. They offer different tools, but we're going to only focus just on one for the remainder of this workshop, and kind of get to know a bit more about that. And so that's going to be needs and identity one. So how do unmet basic needs lead to triggering and escalation? And how does our sense of self, dignity, or recognition get tied into the conflict? So some of these other 5 kind of lenses we looked at, they focus on elites or institutions or the media or like social media. when we talk about needs and identity, this is about why did so many people resonate like with the protests, like, or on, if we're talking about the other side, like why have so many people risen up to resist the protests? So like, what's the basis on which people are deciding to act in this way? And in the world of peace and conflict studies, kind of a big discovery that happened in the 90s was that not only needs, but like also identity is something that's really kind of like a big factor that can help motivate people. And it's kind of easy to think like, oh, if I have unmet basic needs, if they're like my physical needs, like food, I don't have enough food, or I'm not being politically represented and I want to change the country. Like those are easier to make the connection. Oh, so this is why somebody engages in conflict. But what people discovered was also people's sense of self gets tied up in the different camps. So that when one of these camps is attacked, and if I feel identified with that camp, even if I'm not being attacked, I feel attacked. I get triggered, and the escalation cycle continues. So that'll be the next part. But again, just a pause, a breather. Again, is there anything happening in your body? Are there any questions or comments about this this last section? Kind of had a lot of discussion already, actually. So if people feel like we want to move on, that's also okay. It's just a moment to, because actually sometimes with some people, like even talking about the stuff we're talking about is like something that feels illegitimate or unacceptable. So it's like even just talking about this stuff or even legitimizing the other side can evoke a kind of fight, flight, or freeze response. This is also why we're kind of building in these pauses. So part 4, and the last part, coercion, interest, and identity. So ways of responding to conflict and crisis.
Sorry, Josh,
Seth?
I did want to take a minute if you could, if you don't mind.
Yes. Yeah.
I am feeling very ill at ease.
Yes, please.
Part of it, I think, and it seems to me that everybody here generally is not or would not have been part of the protest. I guess I can't help but see sort of two main camps. And so for me, it was very clear that there was one particular camp that came out of an ultra right-wing perspective that was heavily influenced by US politics. And I don't see them here tonight. And I don't see them coming to any peace building or creating opportunity. And so I don't know where this all goes, right? Like I am really interested in trying to converse with, I guess, the people that I would see as having some legitimate issues, but there's that smaller portion that I don't, you know, the ones who wanted to overturn our government, I don't see them being interested at all in having any peace building exercise. So what do we do with them?
There's some of them here tonight.
Are there?
Yep. Not me, but I know I've talked to some other people on this call who I know there are some of them here tonight.
Okay, well, that is neat. That is.
So just to kind of, like I'm happy to kind of share some of my thoughts, but I'm curious about how that makes you feel, some of the stuff you're talking about.
Makes me feel?
Yeah.
Oh, I feel sick. I feel sick about all of this. Just sick. I feel sick about the whole thing. I feel sick about the process. I feel sick about about people who would hold that view. Just sick.
And when you don't perceive people kind of on the possible extreme end of the other side being present at this, like how does that particular part, like how do you feel about that particular part, that they're not here or possibly not here?
I gather now they are. That's intriguing to me. I think that's great. I mean, it suggests to me that there is hope then, yes. And that's fabulous. So yeah. Yeah.
Do you mind if I add, Josh, like
yeah,
what Susan was just saying resonates with me, because in a little bit of the earlier presentation, you were talking about the purpose of this peace building is to build a common future. And my impression is that the protesters were not necessarily interested in building a common future, but in building their future. And
yes,
not building a common future. And so if only one group is interested in encompassing everyone's needs, how do you deal with that?
So I'm actually interested in kind of opening this up to a bit of conversation. Are there people here who would disagree with this assessment of the protest?
I think I would disagree, just to a certain extent, in that those that I have talked with that would have been front and center are doing this for everyone. Like I've had people say to me, which actually somewhat offended me a bit, but saying, I'm fighting for your freedom too. And which kind of leads you to believe that maybe it's about them fighting. But no, I think that those people that were down there in the cold, I don't think it was just self-grandiose behavior. I think they really believed in what they were fighting for, and it was for all of Canadians who didn't see what they saw.
And I don't disagree with that, Tracy, but what I'm trying to point at is their vision of fighting for me is not something that I'm interested in. They're not actually fighting for something I want, so they're not fighting for me.
I agree, and I found that offensive personally. But there's a passion where they would like us to understand how they feel, how they perceive, which can be very difficult. You know, it's a tough thing to do in just a regular conversation, for sure. But I don't, yeah, it all comes down to needs and identity, for sure. Identity is huge. What are they seeking to find? But, you know, I think that a lot of them just felt that they weren't being heard. Anyways, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but anyhow, I just thought I'd add my 2 cents worth there.
And I noticed that Daryl and Richard had their hands up. Daryl?
Yeah, like while I agree with the truckers' mandate, I disagree with the location. Like they all decide to settle downtown where like it's all regular people living there. They're honking, they're not letting them sleep out. Like I don't know what time they're honking during the day, but I just know that people living over there find it terrible to be there right now. And that's why I feel like if the mandate want to actually get through to the government, they should have gone right outside the parliament buildings only, or they should have just gone directly to Trudeau's house and just not let him go to sleep ever. So like, yeah, I just feel like it's just completely wrong what they're doing right now. They shouldn't be downtown. They should be somewhere more appropriate to get to to get the government to listen to them.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that we have a bunch of hands going up right now. So because we still have a bit of stuff to do, like I would just ask that we make these next points succinct, because also there were some questions that were asked earlier that we want to get to. So Richard, then Patty, then Rochelle.
I think we touched on something quite important, which is the perception that somebody is not willing to join a dialogue. In fact, it's more than a perception. It's sometimes a conviction that a certain element will not dialogue. And I think that's key to this whole thing. And I think one from the tracker side, I think an important thing went by almost without comment when they took their manifesto off the website. And I didn't hear anybody asking, does that mean that your position has changed?
Excellent point, Richard. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. Patty?
Oh, I had so many thoughts going through my mind.
And unfortunately, we don't have time for all of them.
I know, I know. I'm just going to touch on a few.
Yeah.
Because we were talking about legitimizing and delegitimizing points of view. The people that came to Ottawa or are represented in Ottawa asked, and many times, and unfortunately, many different leaders for time to dialogue, for time to have conversation, to be heard. And the point that I saw was these were people that had lost much over the coronavirus years, and we're seeing no change, and law was used illegally against them, and there was no seeing an end to that. And so that's the frustration of a party that is trying to have dialogue, has tried to have dialogue, and has been quashed and shut down over and over again. And so that's from the other side. So I am from the other side. I don't know anything about the manifesto. I was represented there for loss of human rights, for loss of Canadian rights. And my view is that if we don't stand up for the smallest group, no matter how small and ignorant, and all those words were so insulting to me. I'm not far right, but I stand up for human rights, and that's my point of view. So I was standing up for you guys.
So again, because this isn't a dialogue space, this was Patty's perspective, but we're not here to kind of explore that or go deeper into that, because we still have some other hands and so a bit more material. So Rochelle and Christina, and then we get back to the two questions that were asked earlier. Rochelle?
Unfortunately, Josh, my comment is going to go into dialogue, but it was what I was going to say. Anyways, No. I don't think you'll find this derails things. I mean, Patty, I mean, I think in terms of these sides, I'm on the other side of you, and what you said was exactly what I was going to say. Like, I see this perfect mirroring between the why can't we have dialogue and why can't we have dialogue, right? And I mean, I think we're often thinking of this as, you know, the protesters asking to meet with Trudeau, or, you know, on one side, I'm trying to think if there's, you know, if you can flip that one. I think we can probably flip that around as well. But honestly, like, when I've sort of spoken to folks who, yeah, are on the other side of this than I am, it's been actually, why does my family member not speak to me, right? Like, why can't I talk to you, my neighbor, about these things, right? That's where I've heard much deeper hurt. Is around those things that honestly has been, you know, and again, these are, again, people who have gone to Ottawa part of this, and, you know, and who funded this, and who, you know, been quite, you know, militaristic even on these sorts of things. The deeper hurt has been on that than on the political side. And I think it's mirror, I feel like it's just a mirror image.
Thanks, Rochelle. Christina.
So another anonymous comment. I feel distrust of the convoy crowd, and as Susan spoke to it, such sadness about cruel and unlawful behaviors.
So I guess more of a comment than a question. Thank you for the writer.
Definitely, Claude.
So to get back to the question that I'm trying to remember, Stefan asked about what happens if the other side doesn't want to engage in dialogue. Even just like in this room, there are people from different sides that have like different readiness to engage in dialogue. And like Joey said, sometimes we have the perception that the other side doesn't want to dialogue. Maybe it's because that's been our personal experience. So like, I wouldn't necessarily assume that nobody on the other side wants to have dialogue. Maybe the kind of dialogue they want is different than the one that we might want. And like, these are things that have to be like engaged with when like we want to do peace building work. Also, not everybody's going to want dialogue, because if, for example, if people are triggered, dialogue can seem like a threat. Like, I don't want to sit on the other side with like I don't want to sit in a room with the other side because of XYZ. And so a lot of times the biggest work happens before the dialogue, because like bring people into a room, it's to help people ground themselves, feel safe, feel heard, feel recognized, feel like a basic need is met. And then they might start opening up to thinking about creative solutions. So like, I think that it's, and this is also something that's like, there's been lots of conflicts, like even armed conflicts, where somebody says the other side will not talk. And then like later the other side talked and something was transformed. So it's like, I think we have to ask questions about, why do I think that the other side doesn't want to talk? Is there a reason why they don't want to talk? Is there a need that's not being met? Is there something else happening? Is some like media telling them not to talk? Is it an incentive from their community not to talk? So like, these are all different factors that are all kind of like playing into this, and we don't have time to get into that today, but like, there are reasons. And like, those are things that like we can try to analyze and address when we try to like do something. And then Susan, actually, I remember you had a question at the very beginning of this long train, and I forget what it was, but I remember I wanted to come back to it. I don't know if you remember what you asked.
I'm sorry, no.
Yeah. So I think then, like, I don't know if like, so Stefan, if like that's the way that you, like, if that's your experience that people don't want to talk, like, I can't say anything about your experience. In my experience, I've experienced something else. And I think, to be honest, when we did the online dialogue a couple of weeks ago, more people were sympathetic to the protest than were not sympathetic that came to the table. So there's, I don't know. It's really complicated. Christina.
So an anonymous question.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to figure out how to dialogue meaningfully with people when they reject my sources of knowledge, whether that's media, scientific research, or personal experience, and I don't trust their sources of knowledge, versions of reality. How can we dialogue when we can't agree on what constitutes reality?
This is an excellent segue into the next section. So first, dialogue isn't necessarily only about information and swapping information. Sometimes we can go to a different level. So there's actually also lots of different techniques for trying to do this kind of thing. But like, we can send resources about those otherwise, but like after the workshop. But like, this identity and need stuff is really about that question. So if we're divided into different informational spheres, what can dialogue be? So first, before we get, what time is it? Yeah, so we have to go quick. So very briefly, a history of kind of conflict resolution and different waves that have kind of happened. There are different ways of responding to conflict and crisis, one of which is coercion, which is resolving conflict by applying power, force, or other non-consensual approaches, often done in violent emergencies to prevent loss of life or to preserve the reputation interests of powerful actors. It's a form of negative peace that can have major consequences down the road. It can be done selfishly, or it can be done to protect certain interests. So for example, when the police went in to break up the protest, this was a coercive act of conflict resolution that was meant to achieve a certain goal. And it comes with pros and it comes with cons. So it's able to resolve a crisis quickly or prevent or stop violence and harm, and it requires less time to implement. Cons, it makes people who already feel marginalized feel further marginalized. It can ignore legitimate needs on the coerced side, and it erodes trust in the side doing the coercion. So that's one model, more associated with like negative peace in a crisis mode. Another mode is interests. So it's about trying to find win-win solutions that address what parties say they want, often through negotiation or joint problem solving. So it's basically like, how do we figure out like a solution that like meets your interests and meets my interests? The positives are like moving past win-lose models, sees the other side as legitimate and trying to do business, but negative, it focuses on what parties say they want. So this is where we start getting into the information stuff. So it's like, I say I want XYZ because I believe this information, right? And so we get stuck. This is the problem with the interest-based approach, because like we have our interests, we have our information, but we still can't really dig deeper because there are some more underlying psychological or human needs that are motivating each camp. So we reach these impasses. Nevertheless, it's still more inclusive and closer to positive peace or an integration of positive and negative peace than coercion, but it's still not getting at certain needs. So in the 90s, in response to Bosnia and to Rwanda, like peace builders started developing identity-based approaches. So needs-based, which is like, how do we figure out our needs? Like, how do we meet people's needs? That's been around since the 60s. But focusing on identity is something that's like relatively new. So only for about the past 30 years or so. And identity-based approaches claim that there are non-negotiable needs that, if threatened, will trigger different camps and escalate the conflict. And if these needs are not recognized by the other side, then the other side can be seen as an existential threat that needs to be resisted. These needs can include security, autonomy, wellness, freedom, dignity, and identity. And by identity, it's like, this is when our sense of self becomes bound up in the sides that we take. So all of a sudden, if you start criticizing my source of information, you become my enemy because my identity becomes tied up in those aspects. So when we're thinking about how to engage in dialogue, when we don't have information, and not only, or when we don't share the same information sources, but not only that, but when even offering different information is like seen as threatening. So like your information is an existential threat to me. So like, what can we do then? So again, this is like, yeah, so this is kind of going back to like, we were like kind of talking about this in the question, like in the context of the question that Christina, but this here is more about escalation. The coercion and negotiation won't make deep-seated differences over values, dignity, or sense of self disappear. So these conflicts over deep-seated differences over values, dignity, or sense of self, these are things that we can talk about even if we don't share information or the right information sources. So it's like, oh, you believe, like I have a friend right now, a former colleague, and so some of you have heard that things in Ukraine right now are not going very well. There might be a war, and we're on different sides of that divide. And we live in completely different information ecosystems, and arguing about the facts isn't going to work. What can work, and what kind of is able to build some kind of connection between us that generates goodwill and a relationship, is talking about, okay, so like I reckon, sorry, I think Lisa, your microphone's on. I think we hear some background noise. Perfect, thank you, sorry about that. So, one thing that we can dialogue about is recognizing that, oh, like you feel really strongly about this because XYZ is important to you. And this is something that's like really common with the convoy protest, like the way that people use words like freedom or autonomy in one camp, and on the other side, like care, solidarity, responsibility. So like these are all values that can be deeply connected to the way that we see ourselves. At least for now, because often in different conflicts, we can switch which values become important to us. But like at this moment, those values become core to how we see ourselves, and we can't negotiate over them. So if we frame the vaccine mandates as an issue of body autonomy, I can't negotiate over that because like my sense of autonomy is like a deep need. This is like something that somebody might say. And on the other side, it's like, oh, like the convoy is causing harm through their horns, like this kind of causing of harm, this is something that's non-negotiable. So like these perceived non-negotiable needs are like getting into conflict with each other. So coercion or negotiation won't make these issues disappear. And if we do use coercion, and this is something that like is of concern to conflict specialists about how the police broke things up, because these feelings aren't going to go away. So even when dormant, grievances, distrust, and fear of the other continue to fester. And like we've seen this with wars, they can be passed down through generations. Like literally in some regions of the world, people will still reference something that happened 500 years ago that like is perpetuated within their community through stories. So these identity-based grievances and this feeling of domination that comes when conflicts are resolved this way, this can continue the escalation, cycle. So this is kind of like a problem, right? But what's one thing that we can do? So as peace builders, if you identify as a peace builder, which doesn't have to be you, but if this is something that's important, looking at things through a needs or identity-based approach recognizes that needs and identities matter. So what are the needs of protesters? What are the core non-negotiable needs that need to be surfaced and engaged with? For the protesters, the locals in the downtown core, the immunocompromised, communities marginalized by mandates or by resistance to the mandates, and the overarching camps that form along a divide. So how do we see how actions like a protest get tied up with notions of dignity, identity, and protection of a central part of the self? So if we can't say, I'm going to trust your information source, if we can't say, I'm going to give you what you want, what are things that we can do? We might not be able to compromise or endorse them, but what can be done to affirm the other side's dignity? Because this is something that can meet these identity needs. So for example, symbolic actions, saying we don't agree with you, but like we appreciate something that you're doing what you believe in, or we appreciate the courage, or something like this. Or even a symbolic action like, I've heard some people who are part of the protester side say that they would like public recognition of the losses suffered by Canadians because of the mandates. For example, a memorial or a statement of condolence. Like that's a symbolic action that could really speak to some of the protesters where they're at. Public recognition of people's needs, even if their positions or interests are not like tenable or acceptable to us. This is something that somebody mentioned earlier, like how do we acknowledge the needs while not endorsing the interest or the position? Another thing we can do is confirming whether our stereotypes or narratives of the other side are accurate or not. And this is something that we can do with dialogue, with communication, with things like this. So, and this can happen on either side, even if the other side isn't willing to do this in return just yet. So it can be asymmetrical. Sometimes one of the sides or one of the parties in a conflict is so triggered that they're not willing to even engage. But by doing these symbolic actions and showing goodwill from one side, this is how trust might start to be built. Some triggering might start to get lowered enough that some people decide, oh, like maybe it's possible to communicate with them. Maybe they don't hate me. Maybe they don't wish me dead. So these are different ins into the situation that we can look at when we realize that like, oh, there's this identity stuff that's also involved. So dialogue is one tool to address these factors. Dialogue is something that I am kind of like particularly involved in, so I'm going to talk about what I know. So Let's Talk Ottawa held a dialogue between supporters and critics of the protests early in February. It was structured to explore creating a map of the different concerns. We had different questions, asking different people how they were affected by mandates, asking people what their own camp was doing to exacerbate the problem. But at the end, we had a question. What's one thing that the other side could say or do that would build trust or give me more hope? And we kind of built like this kind of map of like things that if one side did this and did it publicly would help start rebuilding trust. And that might start to create like different bridges that would allow for, even if we don't see eye to eye, or if we don't want the same things, it would start to rebuild relationships, to depolarize, so we can start seeing each other like as legitimate or with legitimate needs that need to be addressed. So for protesters, people were asking them for more messages denouncing extremists, acknowledging that mandates were particularly like that less mandates or dropping mandates is like costly to the immunocompromised, condemning and curbing aggression to locals on the street. And then for counter protesters, they were asking for recognition that protesters have valid needs that need to be engaged with. So for example, there's a lot of talk about Trudeau. He didn't legitimize or he didn't even acknowledge or engage with protesters, kind of saying that they were fringe and with unacceptable views. This marginalizes people, right? And so like some kind of symbolic action to say, you know, like we don't agree with what you're doing, but like not painting them in this picture, this can be something that can be quite powerful and like really change people's approach to something. There's also desire for media to present a more accurate image of downtown. I was not downtown, so I don't know how accurate it was. I've heard different things, but this was a really big grievance that protesters had, that they felt misrepresented nationally and internationally, which makes them distrust the media even more. And there were also there's also desire to support more inclusive debates over mandates and pandemic response. So we actually had whole lists of these possible gestures that one side could make for the other that would start making steps to rebuilding trust and hope. And like when we dialogue, we can build maps like this. We can get people talking and produce new ideas for ways to move forward, if those ideas can get to the right people in time. So somebody was also asking about what do we do when people are extremists and don't want to talk. And in every camp, there are going to be people who don't want to talk, but you might not have to talk to everybody to produce these kinds of ideas. So there's one kind of dialogue where the entire purpose is to generate new ideas for policymakers. So we had actually the report that we did from the convoy dialogue a couple weeks ago. It was passed around some people, and now they're thinking about, they're thinking maybe we're going to fund like a full project to try to do stuff like this. So like that one dialogue that we had was like seen by certain people, and like now there might be interest in like institutionalizing this kind of approach. That was just like, literally there was like 25 or 30 people on that call. But like when the channels are right, like that can still have an impact on something. So again, these are things that like it's such a complex situation, and like there's no one size fits all. But when we look at go back to the conflict mapping, these are all different ways that peace builders have found useful for finding creative solutions. And these are things that are not always being used in certain contexts, like with the convoy context. And so for some conflict specialists, there's a desire to kind of raise awareness that these are ways that we can look at it, and that's there's a way to legitimize the needs of both sides, even if we don't agree or see eye to eye on stuff, and that maybe we might be able to come up with creative solutions that move us forward. I think we're coming close to the end right now. I see there's some questions in the chat. So can this contribute to change?
3 minutes.
Thank you. So according to specialist, strategies like this have been known to interrupt cycles of escalation, address unmet needs that give rise to conflict, and build a basis of respect that can provide a solid foundation for eventual negotiations, settlements, and the transformation of structures. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. But again, this needs an identity bit is just one piece of puzzle, and there's lots more pieces than this. And so this is a very short, it was a lot of information, but it was a very short kind of introduction to what are some of the things that peace builders think about, and how might they be kind of applied to look at the convoy and think about like what are the things that we can do. So let's talk Ottawa, an organization where we want to create space for growth, collaboration, and developing mutual understanding within the city. And so we host events like this. And that's it from us tonight. Thank you very much. So before you go, I'm just gonna take off the screen and final questions or comments. There was 3 hands I saw that were up. I don't know, I don't see any hands right now. So very short, because people are going to leave very soon and we still have some announcements and other things. So Christina and then Richard.
So it's a question, I don't know if you'll have time to answer it. How do we deal with a party that lies repeatedly and isn't honest about their agenda, i.e. they are not acting in good faith?
So yeah, like that's
too big for tonight.
That's a whole other workshop, right? Like there are things that like we can do, like maybe we're not going to be like talking with that party if that's the way they are. Maybe that's our perception and we need to like challenge our perception of that. Maybe we're triggered and so we're just seeing it like this and we need to maybe step back and take some breath and see if like is the way that I'm perceiving it accurate or not. Maybe they do have an agenda, but like maybe there are other people that we can talk to. Maybe there are people that are able to pressure that party, you know? So like there's different ways that we can kind of go about this, which is like a bit of a cop-out answer, but it's like, it's a bit of a ridiculous question, like in terms of like ridiculous in terms of how big it is. Because there are structural issues, and this is it. This is like the leader, the unequal access of power of representation, and those are much harder to deal with than these identity stuff. So like the identity and the needs, these are things that we can do on a community level. These are things that the people in this room can do, but we need bigger solutions for power structures like that, and that's something that's a big job. Richard.
This may also be a topic for another workshop, and my question is, in the last 3 weeks, where were the peacemakers and the mediators? There in this city, there are rich resources, but maybe the questions are, you know, when is intervention appropriate? How can it take place? Does it have to be requested? All kinds of stuff. But yeah, there seems to me an absence of any effort.
So I think, yeah. I think there's also a lack of resources because this is the kind of work that takes like a lot of time and a lot of money, and like there's not people paying for it, you know? So after our dialogue, there was an offer to actually start like a month-long kind of pilot to actually do something. And I was even like said, okay, so maybe we fly you back and like we start working on some stuff. But like it was already too late, you know? Because like, okay, now we're gonna put the money together. And it's like, a few days later, like things escalated and it's like in another stage right now, you know? So it's like, it's also like the sources of money are often bureaucratic and have interests of their own. So maybe there are other models we have to do. Like for example, when I run workshops like this, I ask for donations. So spoiler for what I'm gonna talk about in a few minutes. But like, that's a different model, right? Because like it takes a lot of time to engage with this kind of thing, right? So it's like, that kind of grassroots model is like one economic model, but like facilitation and training and doing the stuff like this, like we don't have bandwidth, we don't have the resources. And so we have to communicate that there's a need for this. So that's kind of part of, and maybe some people were a lot of great mediators, but they were just really tired, or maybe they were triggered. Like there's so many different things. Like I know that Richard, you're part of the Initiatives to Change community, and I'm really curious about what conversations happen inside that community when stuff like this happens, and if there are people who want to act or who don't want to act, or what are the different conversations. But that's kind of a conversation for another day. But like I don't know who's talking about what, and maybe there is another project like Let's Talk Ottawa, and we just don't know about it, because this is also quite small, and there's lots of people who don't know about us. And some comments. Many things could have gotten. Yeah. There were negotiations between like I think Leash, what's her name, Tamara, and Watson. So there were backroom deals, also between City Hall and the protesters. So like that was mediation and negotiation that was ongoing. So like there are lots of things that were happening in the background, but they're not inclusive processes, which kind of come with their own issues. Anyway, so tonight's workshop was an information dump. it was just like, what are some frameworks that peace builders think about when and how they can be applied to stuff like this? It's not enough time to give any of them justice because it is 3 a.m. here. And if I was in Ottawa, I would love to do like a series exploring things kind of in depth and workshops where we actually analyze and think of solutions and like see if what we can do, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe we would just talk and have tea, and that's okay too. Like it's again, like this dilemma, we don't have bandwidth to do everything that we need to do. So this like workshop tonight was just like a very small attempt to kind of give some of these frameworks. So that was kind of the thing for tonight. Thank you for sticking around. As promised earlier, now I'm going to be sending a link into the chat. And so this link is for 2 things. One is for the lovely donations to help the thing run. 2, on the sheet is actually feedback. So this let us know how this meeting was for you. There were a couple people at the beginning of the chat who messaged me in private saying that they didn't realize that this meeting was going to be this format. They thought it was going to be another dialogue, so they left. So it's important, like it's good for us to know, like, was this something that was useful? Was this a format that was helpful? What might you be taking away from tonight? What things could be improved? And so on and so forth. So, and then there's also information, like there's space to put down like what other kind of events or workshops you'd like to see from Let's Talk Ottawa in the future. And stuff like that. Also, you can leave your contact information if you want to be contacted for being on the email list or other stuff, or if you want to collaborate on something, that's all there. Also, I just wanted to say that like a lot of you asked like really good, really complex questions that I'm not able to answer because it's just like such a big issue. So thank you for your patience as well. And sorry if you felt like you weren't addressed properly. This is just unfortunately the nature of doing this at 3 in the morning. But so thank you for your patience. Okay, so I'm putting in the link again, and I would love you guys to open up the feedback sheet, and I'll give you 5 minutes to start working on it. And then if you want to continue it afterwards, it's also good. But there's time for now. And then after that, that's it.
After that, you're going to bed, right?
I'm gonna play video games until 8 in the morning. No, go to bed. Go to bed. Flee to bed. Yes.
So Josh, having something on the Ukraine thing would be great to get your expertise and knowledge of, because it's just way confusing.
I was going to say exactly the same. Yes.
It's kind of depressing right now. So like,
yep,
really.
Yeah. So other like, so like this kind of like Ottawa culture war, like North America stuff is like kind of one area where like I'm kind of like doing stuff, but the other one is actually Russia and Ukraine. So I normally actually live in Russia. So this is like particularly depressing. So I'm kind of a little downhearted when it comes to that and not in the mood for info dumps. But
okay,
it took a turn for the worst 2 days ago. And so Russia just acknowledged the separatist territories, which they didn't do. And so that's a step in a very particular direction. But they were de-escalating it for like 3 weeks. Like American media were saying they were going to invade tomorrow for like 3 weeks, but it actually wasn't true. But then like something actually escalated a couple days ago. And so now it's like in the worry zone. So yeah. Anyway,
well, maybe
if we're talking, that means you weren't filling out your feedback sheets.
I just finished.
Excellent. Wonderful. Multitasking. Okay. So normally this is also the part where we talk about announcements, but this was kind of like a special edition workshop because I'm in a different time zone, but I felt really strong about this, so we organized it. If there's funding to do a project and I come back, then I'd love to kind of do more stuff. But if not, then this 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. time slot is not really comfortable. So this is probably the last you'll hear from this for a little while, unless there are other people who want to collaborate and do stuff with Let's Talk Ottawa on the ground, which could like be interesting. And if you're interested in that, there's space in the feedback sheet to discuss interest and things.
Saturday morning workshop? Then it's only afternoon in your case?
Who's going to come to a workshop on Saturday morning?
Me?
Me?
Yeah, me.
Oh, I guess like this is what happens when it's lockdown and nobody goes out on Friday night.
Surprise.
Or you're just over 40 and you don't go out on Friday nights anyway.
I am under 40.
Just if that's, we'd love to hear more from you, Josh.
So if so, then let me know in the feedback sheet if there's anything in particular, because like this was kind of like a sampling of different things, but like if there's particular like needs or particular interests, then like it's not hard to organize something like this. So yeah, anyway, that's all from me. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you very much.
Bonne nuit, tout le monde.
Bonne nuit.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bonne soirée.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night, everyone.